Go to almost any zoo or wildlife park and you're guaranteed to see some truly majestic creatures. From the African bush elephant to the mighty Bengal tiger, these animals are the giants of today. But sadly, the Earth used to be home to many more megafauna members than it is today. Take the woolly mammoth, for example. These enormous beasts lived across Eurasia during the Pleistocene epoch, but they vanished around 10,000 years ago at the end of the Ice Age. Then there's the giant molamola, a creature that literally dwarfs the modern-day gorilla. It once roamed the forests of the Congo, but it disappeared from the fossil record about 20,000 years ago. And we haven't even mentioned the megalodon, which was an absolute unit of a shark that reached lengths of over 20 meters. It lived until just 3.6 million years ago, but its extinction may have had more to do with something else other than climate change. But when it comes to most of these long-extinct species, including many of those just mentioned, scientists are still in the dark about why they vanished. That's because there are very few fossils to go around, so scientists have turned to a new resource instead: ancient DNA. Now, this may sound like science fiction, but it's actually possible to sequence the DNA of extinct animals provided their remains are well preserved. The trouble is, this is actually quite rare. But recently, scientists have managed to get their hands on some. In 2020, a team of researchers reported sequencing the first-ever genome of an extinct animal, the aforementioned woolly mammoth. They found that this iconic beast died out because of the warming climate. But other studies have pointed to another culprit: humans. And indeed, it's likely that our species played some role in the extinction of many megafauna. When humans moved into an area, large animals started disappearing. But that doesn't tell us why. Maybe they were hunted, or perhaps the two species simply competed for resources. Today, scientists are hoping to use ancient DNA to solve the mystery of a different extinct giant, the woolly rhinoceros. This prehistoric beast looked a lot like its modern-day cousin, but it had one major difference: 2 horns. That's right. Unlike the single-horned rhinoceros of today, the woolly rhinoceros had 2. To find out why, a team of researchers extracted ancient DNA from a specimen that was found in Siberia and compared it with the DNA of the Sumatran rhinoceros, the only rhino species with 2 horns. They discovered that the woolly rhino got its double horns from its mother, just like the Sumatran rhino. This trait was then lost again after more evolutionary changes took place. Basically, the woolly rhino was a sort of genetic hybrid between the single-horned rhino and the 2-horned Sumatran rhino. What's more, the study suggests that this transformation happened fairly recently in evolutionary terms, maybe as little as 250,000 years ago. And it seems likely that this change came with some drawbacks. After all, woolly rhinos went extinct around 14,000 years ago. Not exactly a great track record. But the loss of these 2 horns wasn't necessarily what caused them to die out. In fact, that's not clear yet. But in the future, studying their DNA could help researchers figure it out. One thing's for sure, though: it's unlikely to be down to climate change. You see, woolly rhinos preferred cold, dry climates and were found as far north as the 70th parallel, just 230 kilometers from the North Pole. But surely climate change couldn't have been so severe back then, right? Well, a recent study has shown that woolly rhinos didn't just live on the northern hemisphere's rim, but also much further south, showing that the climate change-driven range shifts pushed them to their eventual doom. But there's a twist. Although woolly rhinos did migrate southwards, this didn't push them into a warmer climate. Instead, they ended up in a much drier one. And this is where things get interesting. That's because woolly rhinos belong to a group of animals known as Megafauna, which disappeared from most of Europe around 12,000 years ago. And a recent study suggests that this wasn't due to climate change either. Megafauna are generally defined as animals that weigh more than 40 kilograms. But of course, this isn't a precise scientific category. Nevertheless, it's a useful way of grouping animals together for certain purposes. And since roughly 12,000 years ago, Europe's megafauna went from abundant to practically non-existent. Something weird is definitely going on here. As we've already discussed, woolly rhinos and woolly mammoths were driven to extinction by changing climatic conditions. But there are plenty of other European megafauna whose extinctions don't fit this narrative. Take the Mosbach wolf, for instance. It was a massive canine that was about twice the size of a gray wolf. It arrived in Europe from Asia 40,000 years ago and quickly became the continent's top predator. But just 15,000 years later, it was gone. Genetic analysis has revealed that it wasn't related to modern wolves, but instead was part of a lineage that split from the gray wolf around 130,000 years ago. Interestingly, this ancestor was thought to have been smaller than the modern gray wolf, meaning the Mosbach wolf evolved gigantism independently of its modern counterpart. However, the Mosbach wolf's reign of terror was short-lived. Between 14,000 and 9,000 years ago, Europe went through a period of rapid environmental change. Temperatures rose by around 4 degrees, and rainfall increased by about 20%. Some researchers think that the Mosbach wolf, with its thick fur coat, was ill-equipped to deal with this sudden heat. Plus, its large size meant it needed lots of food. So when the climate changed, it would have required a lot of energy to keep itself cool and find enough to eat. Eventually, it died out. Others argue that competition with returning bears, wolves, and other predators drove the Mosbach wolf to its grave. Either way, it's unlikely that climate change was a major factor. The same can be said for the straight-tusked elephant. Once again, we have an animal whose disappearance does not fit with climate change. But there's a twist. A recent paper suggests that a combination of factors may have been at play. During the last ice age, Europe was largely covered in tundra and steppe. There was very little forest, meaning the continent's herbivores had to migrate southwards to find food during the summer months. But as the climate warmed, this became increasingly difficult. At the same time, the amount of precipitation in Europe was steadily increasing. By the Younger Dryas, about 12,800 years ago, the continent was a much greener place than it had been for thousands of years. Unfortunately for the straight-tusked elephant, it didn't possess the adaptations needed to thrive in this new environment. With the exception of a few isolated populations in southern Europe, they went extinct. Here, climate change seems to have tipped the balance in favor of the more adaptable woolly elephant. But let's shift our attention away from Europe and return to the mighty molamola, a gorilla relative that stood nearly 3 meters tall and weighed over 1.8 tons. This makes it the largest primate that's ever existed. Its massive size should have given it an advantage in times of ecological chaos. So why did it die out? Well, according to one researcher, it was too big. In a recent study, he argued that the molamola was essentially a hypergiganized gorilla, having evolved to its massive size after the formation of the Congo rainforest. But although this may have been advantageous in the lush rainforest, it proved to be the molamola's downfall when the climate dried around 20,000 years ago. See, the forest began to shrink, forcing the molamola and other megafauna to move into the savanna. The problem was that these habitats had much lower carrying capacities, meaning they could only support small numbers of megafauna. Ultimately, the molamola paid the price for being too big. Not only did it need lots of food, but its huge size meant it had a slower reproductive rate. The perfect storm, therefore, saw this gentle giant disappear. So we've covered a mammoth, a rhinoceros, a wolf, an elephant, and a bizarre ape-like creature. And none of these extinctions seem to have been primarily caused by climate change. Of course, this doesn't mean climate change hasn't affected megafauna. After all, it has led to the fragmentation of habitats, which causes problems for any large animal with high spatial requirements. But if megafauna extinctions are not mainly caused by climate change, what are? We'll leave that question for you to answer in the comments.